Emotional incest, emotional prostitution. Let's look at the difference between those two things, if there's a difference at all. Hang on. So that may sound kind of strong there, right? That beginning, emotional incest, if you're a victim of that, is that the same as being a prostitute when I use the term emotional prostitution? Well, let's look at that in terms of if somebody's a victim of emotional incest, it's kind of like being a prostitute. You're being used. You're being used by your parent, the perpetrating parent. You're a thing or an object. That's kind of like what we think of a prostitute out on the streets, right? With emotional incest, there's no real you there. You have to perform for your parent in a way. Same thing with prostitution out on the street, or even a high level, so to speak, prostitute who's supposedly making the big bucks. There's no real them there. They're performing for their pimp, perhaps. Or they're performing just as a way to make money, not doing anything that ties into good self-care, right? So they're willing to sell themselves, so to speak, because they don't really matter inside, is basically how they feel about themselves. And with emotional incest, the child has learned to want something, meaning they're denied actual authentic love. It's very conditional from the parent because they're certainly not being loved for who they really are. After all, they're having to be the mini husband or the mini wife. So they want real love. They want real connection. As they get older, they don't know how to do that unless maybe they get into therapy to help them. And with sexual prostitution, they want something too. Perhaps they're trying to substitute having a lot of sex to make up for love, the father that never loved them perhaps, or they want money. But either way, they want something. It's not coming from a place of equanimity, of balance. It's coming from someone's down here and they want something, and somebody's up here who can give it. With being a victim of emotional incest, there's a history of abuse. That's what being a victim of emotional incest is. You're not allowed to have your healthy developmental identity stages. You're being prostituted to your parent in a way. They need you because they're feeling so empty inside. So we can say that that has a history of being traumatized, being used. Look at sexual prostitution. When you look at any studies of prostitutes out there in the world who are actively selling their body, 80 to 90% come from a history of some sort of sexual trauma, child abuse, all types of dysfunction in their family of origin, then leads to their choice of profession. So emotional incest is in a way like prostitution. It's emotional prostitution. The problem is that the victim has no say in it. It has nothing to do with it. The parent is controlling it all. And to add fuel to the fire, if it's a two-parent household, there's usually one parent who's doing the perpetrating and the other who's watching, like the pimp, so to speak, and doing nothing to stop it. And that's what makes it so hard for victims of emotional incest, because there's the parent who is taking them over, who emotionally smothered them for their own benefit. And then oftentimes they'll bring up in therapy that their mother was also at home if the dad was the perpetrator, or the dad was also at home if the mother was the perpetrator, and they stood back and let it happen. They didn't have much of a voice. They were weak. They were submissive. They were afraid in a way of their husband or wife. They learned to just shut up and let this happen because they were afraid of conflict. They took the easy way out, so to speak. In the view of prostitution, there's an abuse of power. If someone's out on the street, they may be being coerced by their pimp. Perhaps they're part of the child trafficking that we're hearing a lot more about these days. And like a child, a victim of emotional incest, they're being coerced. They're a little kid. It starts as early as 2, 3, 4, or 5 years old and continues up. Well, they don't have a voice to stand up for themselves. They don't even know what standing up for themselves means. They're too young to know any different, but they do know they're in a chaotic world around a parent where everything seems to focus on that parent and their needs, and the child is wondering, where do I fit in here? And begins to learn very quickly that I better please that parent or they seem like they're going to withhold their love. And oftentimes the parent does withhold their love as a manipulation, as a way to get the child to do what they want them to do. And there can be many sick ways of doing this. It can range from being passive aggressive to playing the martyr, to guilt tripping the child, all sorts of ways. So one difference we could say is a person who grows up to be a sexual prostitute, at least on some level, they could be making the choice. Not always, but if they're 18 or 20 or 25 and they're going into that world, that's their choice to some degree. They may not understand the unconscious drive as to why they're choosing that, but at least in their mind, they're making that choice. But to a little kid, a victim of emotional incest, they're not making a choice at all. And as a kid grows up who's a victim of emotional incest, you do begin to feel more and more like a prostitute, because you begin to realize, especially when you get into your teenage years and older, you're not really being valued for who you are. You can sense it. And your parent may be trying to buy you or please you in all kinds of ways. And it's confusing because, well, they're giving you money for anything you want. They're willing to pay my college education. If I need anything at all, they're like, here, take it, it's yours. So on the one hand, they're giving, which you have to think of as a way to sort of control or a way to keep them enmeshed with them somehow. And also you're not being valued for who you really are, because you know you have to play a role. You know there's some sort of condition here. You know whenever you've tried to disagree with them, present your authentic self, let them know what you're really all about. There's many levels to a child, but with a victim of emotional incest, they're not able to show all these levels. They have to be one way, which is confined in a box that the parent wants them to be, and the child grows up to be really good at being a chameleon, being a wallflower, not being able to find their voice because they don't know their voice, because they weren't allowed to begin processing their real feelings as a young child. So they begin to feel like they're a prostitute in certain ways because they're not loved for who they really are. They feel like a thing, they feel like they're being used, they're feeling like they've been taken advantage of, and that's very similar to what a prostitute out on the street is doing when they're wanting to sell sex. So a lot to think about here for any victims of emotional incest out there who are watching this. Let me know your thoughts. Did you feel used? Do you feel like perhaps you're an emotional prostitute? Please subscribe to my mental health YouTube channel if you like these kind of videos. And until next week, this is Brad Shore signing off from Ask a Shrink.